she had me removed from the wedding reception by a staff member. Not by my son, not by her family, but by a young man in a white shirt who found me during cocktail hour, leaned close, and said very quietly that there had been a situation and that I should perhaps wait in the lobby. I was 70 years old, wearing the suit I had bought for the occasion, and I had paid for the entire buffet being served inside that hall. I went to the lobby as requested. Then I called the catering company and cancelled the full order. What happened inside that reception room over the next 30 minutes was the most expensive lesson my daughter-in-law ever received. But to explain that phone call, I need to take you further back. I need to take you back to the 18 months before the wedding, during which I watched a woman enter my son's life and decide, methodically, that I was not the kind of father-in-law she intended to have. I need to explain what I gave, what I paid for, what I arranged, and how I was thanked for each of these contributions. I also need to explain who my son is and what it costs a father to watch his child choose someone else's comfort over the dignity of the parent who raised him. This is not a simple story, but the ending is simple, because what I did in that lobby was entirely within my rights. Before I continue, I want to ask you to subscribe to this channel if you have not done so already. Leave a comment below telling me where you are watching from, whether that is across the country or on the other side of the world. These stories are not fiction. They come from lives actually lived, from moments that happened in real rooms to real people. If any part of what you have heard so far touches something you recognize, you are not imagining it. You are not alone. This community is built on exactly that kind of recognition. Now let me tell you who I am, and who my son Thomas is, and how we came to be on opposite sides of a reception room door. My name is Raymond. I am 70 years old. I was a hotel manager for 35 years, eventually overseeing a large regional property before I retired. I know the hospitality industry from the inside, which means I know exactly what things cost and what you receive for each dollar you spend. After my wife, Helen, died of a stroke 9 years ago, I raised Thomas alone through his final years of school and through university. He was 22 when she died, and I was 61, and the two of us learned, slowly and without much grace, how to be a family of two rather than three. Thomas is a good man at his core. I believed this then. I believe it now. What I did not understand was how much of that goodness could be redirected by a determined woman. Thomas met Claudia 3 years ago at a professional conference. She worked in marketing. She was sharp, confident, and very specific about what she wanted. I met her for the first time at a dinner Thomas arranged 6 weeks into their relationship. She shook my hand with the warmth of a business acquaintance, asked me 2 polite questions, spent the rest of the meal talking to Thomas, and thanked me for dinner as if I had been the waiter rather than the father. I told myself I was being uncharitable. I told myself she was nervous. I kept telling myself these things through the engagement party she planned without consulting me, through the guest list that included none of my oldest friends, and through the wedding budget conversation she controlled entirely. I offered to pay for the wedding, not because Claudia asked me to, though she made her expectations clear through Thomas in a way that kept her hands clean of the direct request. I offered because Thomas is my only child, and his wedding was something I had imagined contributing to since he was small. I had the means to do it properly. The total covered the venue rental, the flowers, the music, the photography, and the full catering package, including the reception buffet. I signed the contracts, paid the deposits, and handed over the final balances as each was due. Claudia reviewed every choice I made and vetoed several, replacing them with her own selections at higher cost, which I also paid without complaint. The catering contract was in my name. I want to be clear about this because it matters to everything that follows. The catering company was a firm I had worked with during my hotel years. I had a relationship with their director, a woman named Miriam. I trusted their work completely. When I signed the contract and paid the deposit, I did so as the contracting party. The full buffet for 180 guests, including a hot service, a seafood station, a dessert table, and late-night snacks, was agreed, confirmed, and scheduled entirely under my name and my payment. Claudia knew this. She had seen the contract. She had requested several additions to it. She understood who had made the event financially possible. In the 4 months before the wedding, my role in the planning shifted gradually. Initially, I was consulted on decisions. Then, I was informed of decisions already made. Then, I was simply presented with invoices. Claudia managed all vendor communication directly, routing everything through her email rather than mine, even though I was the contracting party. When I raised this with Thomas, he said Claudia liked to be organized and that one point of contact made things easier. I accepted this. I continued paying each invoice as it arrived. I attended the venue walkthrough and sat quietly while Claudia directed the event coordinator as though she were the one who had spent 35 years in the hospitality industry. I remained polite. I was watching carefully. The first exclusion was the rehearsal dinner. Claudia had organized a dinner the evening before the wedding for the wedding party and close family. I assumed I would attend. Thomas called me 3 days before to say that the dinner would be at Claudia's parents' home and that the space was limited. He said it would be immediate family and the wedding party only. When I pointed out that I was immediate family, he said Claudia felt the arrangement would be more comfortable for everyone if I attended the wedding itself rather than the rehearsal. I said nothing on the phone. I wished him a good rehearsal. I hung up and sat in my kitchen for a while, thinking about Helen and what she would have advised me to say. More, she would have said. You should have said more. At the ceremony, which took place in a small chapel, I was seated in the second row. I had assumed I would walk my son to the altar, or at least stand beside him in some capacity. I found out from Thomas's best man on the day of the ceremony that Claudia had arranged for her father and her brother to stand with Thomas during the ceremony. I was given a boutonniere and a seat. Thomas looked at me once from the altar, and then looked away quickly. I smiled at him. I meant that smile completely. He was my son, and he was getting married, and I loved him, and none of what was happening changed that. But I was taking notes on every single thing I saw. The reception began at a venue I had selected and paid to rent. I arrived with the other guests, was seated at a table near the back of the room, and found my name card placed between 2 of Claudia's cousins I had never met. The table closest to the head table, where Thomas and Claudia sat with both sets of parents, had 6 seats: Claudia's mother, Claudia's father, Claudia's sister and brother-in-law, Thomas's best man, and the maid of honor. I had not been included at that table. When I saw the seating arrangement, I did not react. I found my seat, introduced myself pleasantly, and poured a glass of water. The buffet I had paid for was being arranged along the far wall. It looked exactly as Miriam had promised. During cocktail hour, I approached Thomas to offer my congratulations. He embraced me briefly and said he was glad I had come. Claudia, standing at his side, looked past me at someone behind me while I spoke to him, turning her body slightly away and beginning a conversation with another guest, before I had finished speaking. It was not an accident. She had done the same thing at the engagement party when I had tried to speak about Helen, about how proud she would have been of Thomas. Claudia had simply turned away. Thomas had not asked her to stop. I had filed that away. I had been filing everything away. I did not yet know how useful that file would become in the next 45 minutes. The moment it ended was when the young man in the white shirt found me during cocktail hour. He leaned close and said there had been a situation brought to his attention and that he had been asked to suggest I might be more comfortable waiting in the lobby while things were sorted out. He was doing his job, delivering a message that had been given to him. I asked who had instructed him. He said one of the event coordinators had passed along the request. I knew who the event coordinator reported to on that day. I nodded pleasantly, excused myself from the couple I had been speaking with, and walked calmly to the lobby. I sat in an upholstered chair near the entrance and took out my telephone. I called Miriam directly. She answered on the second ring because she always answered her phone during events. I explained briefly that the situation had changed and that I needed to cancel the catering order in its entirety. She said the buffet had already been set and service was beginning. I told her I was aware of that and that I was exercising my right as the contracting party to withdraw the service. She said it would mean removing the food from the tables. I said yes. She asked if I was absolutely certain. I told her I had managed hospitality operations for 35 years and that I was very certain. She paused for 2 seconds. Then she said she would handle it. She did. The buffet was cleared within 20 minutes. 180 guests walked to the tables and found them empty. What happened inside the reception room during those 20 minutes was described to me later by 2 guests who called me the following day. The initial response was confusion. Guests assumed the removal was a transition between service courses. Then the event coordinator spoke to Claudia, and whatever was said, the color left Claudia's face entirely. Thomas was told next. He left the head table and went to speak with the venue manager. The venue manager confirmed that the catering contract had been cancelled by the contracting party, which was not Thomas and was not Claudia. It was me. Thomas then stood in the middle of the reception room and said nothing for a long moment before returning to the head table and sitting down. I did not return to the reception. I sat in the lobby for a few more minutes and then called a car and went home. I did not send a message to Thomas. I did not call anyone. I made myself a simple meal, sat in the kitchen where Helen used to sit after dinner with her tea, and thought about the day quietly. I was not gleeful. I was not triumphant. What I felt was something more precise than either of those things. I felt that I had responded appropriately to a situation using the only instrument available to me at that moment, which was the legal right that came from being the person whose name was on the contract. I felt, for the first time in months, that I had been seen, even if only by myself. Thomas called the following morning. I let him speak at length before responding. He said I had humiliated him at his own wedding. I told him I had been physically removed from his wedding reception by a staff member acting on instructions from his new wife, while the food I had paid for was being served in the venue I had rented, at the event I had made financially possible. I told him I had then exercised the only right available to me, which was the right to cancel a contract bearing my name. I told him I had not shouted, made a scene, or confronted anyone directly. I had walked to the lobby, made one phone call, and gone home. Then I asked him what he thought I should have done differently. Thomas did not have an immediate answer. He called back later that day with one that Claudia had clearly helped prepare. He said I should have spoken to them privately before making any decisions. I told him I had been removed from the building without any opportunity for a private conversation. He said it was a misunderstanding. I told him a misunderstanding is when you tell someone dinner is at 7 and they arrive at 8. What had happened was a decision Claudia had made and Thomas had allowed. He went quiet. I told him I loved him and nothing about that had changed. But love does not require a person to absorb contempt in silence, and I had responded with the only tool I had at that moment. He needed to understand the difference between those two things. I did not try to explain myself to anyone else. I did not call Claudia's parents. I did not reach out to guests. I let the event speak for itself. I spent the week after the wedding in deliberate quiet, going about my days, visiting Helen's grave on Thursday, as I always did, reading in the evenings, thinking about what kind of relationship with Thomas might still be possible. I was not preparing further action. What had happened at the wedding was complete. The rest was about what came next, and whether Thomas would find the honesty inside himself to have the real conversation we had never quite managed to have about what had been building for 18 months before that reception room. Over the following weeks, I had several conversations with Thomas alone, without Claudia present, which he agreed to reluctantly. I told him plainly what I had observed over the previous 18 months. I described the rehearsal dinner exclusion, the seating arrangement, the conversations Claudia had turned away from when I spoke about Helen, and the lobby instruction on the wedding day. I did not exaggerate any of it. I did not ask him to choose between his wife and his father. I simply asked him to be honest with me about what he had known and when he had known it. Those conversations were difficult. Some ended without resolution. But they were honest in a way our conversations had not been in a very long time. I also spoke with a family mediator, not because I expected Thomas and Claudia to attend, but because I wanted guidance on how to navigate a situation where a parent has been systematically excluded by a child's partner. The mediator helped me understand several things clearly. My role was not to force confrontation or win an argument, but to establish, with consistency and patience, the basic conditions under which I was willing to have a relationship with them both. One condition was that I would not be treated as invisible. Another was that Thomas would not relay messages through Claudia that he was unwilling to say himself. I wrote these conditions down clearly and brought them to a later conversation with Thomas, so there was no ambiguity. I did not pursue any legal claim related to the wedding. The catering cancellation had been entirely within my legal rights as the contracting party, and I had no interest in litigation for its own sake. I was interested in clarity. I wanted Thomas to understand what had happened and why, arrived at through honesty rather than through pressure or punishment. I also visited my lawyer during this period to draft a will. I had none at that point. I was 70 years old and in good health, but I recognized that the absence of a formal document was itself a vulnerability. I created one that reflected my actual relationships and intentions rather than the assumed ones, clearly articulating what I expected from anyone who would eventually benefit from what I had spent my life building. Claudia, from what Thomas told me indirectly in the months that followed, had her own account of the wedding day in which she had done nothing wrong, and I had acted with spectacular selfishness, ruining the reception and embarrassing her in front of her family. This version did not include the lobby. It did not include the seating arrangement or the rehearsal dinner or any of the preceding 18 months. In her account, the story began with the empty buffet tables and ended there. She was the victim of an unstable and vindictive old man. This version was shared with her parents, her sister, and several guests. I did not counter it publicly. I had no interest in a public dispute about events that both parties already understood perfectly well. Thomas occupied a position I recognized as deeply uncomfortable. He was standing between two people who both said they loved him and both expected alignment. He spent several months attempting to broker a truce that would not require him to acknowledge what either party had actually done, which is what people do when they are not yet ready to see the full picture. I gave him time. I continued our conversations when he wanted them. I did not press. I had learned from 35 years of management that you cannot force a person toward a conclusion they are not ready to reach. You create the conditions. You remain present. And when they are ready, you are still there. The shift came about 8 months after the wedding, on a Sunday when Thomas arrived at my house without warning. He sat in the kitchen and said he wanted to talk about what had actually happened. He spoke for nearly 2 hours. He described conversations with Claudia he had not previously shared. He described moments when he had stayed silent, knowing he should have spoken. He described the lobby instruction and told me he had known about it beforehand and had not stopped it because he had not wanted a confrontation on his wedding day. He said he had been wrong. He said it without prompting. He said it directly to my face. That sentence, spoken in my kitchen on a Sunday morning, was the most important thing he had said to me in years. That conversation was the most honest Thomas and I had had since Helen died. I told him again that I loved him, and that nothing changed that, but that I needed him to understand what had happened and why I had responded as I did. I told him the catering cancellation was not a tantrum. It was the only voice I had at that moment, the only instrument entirely mine in a room full of things I had paid for and arranged. He nodded. He said he understood. He said he did not know how to fix it. I told him fixing it was less important than not repeating it. The way to not repeat it began with him being willing to have the honest conversations he had been avoiding with both of us for too long. Claudia and I have not had a direct conversation about the wedding day as of the time I am telling you this. Whether we eventually do remains uncertain. What I know is that Thomas is in a different place than he was before. He calls more often. He arrives sometimes without warning, which Helen always said was the truest measure of comfort between people. He sat in her chair last month without thinking about it, naturally, the way you sit in the chair that is closest when you walk into a room you feel you belong in. I noticed it. I did not say anything. I just made the tea. Some things repair themselves slowly, in small gestures, in cups of tea poured without asking, in chairs that no longer need any explanation at all. My relationship with Claudia remains formal. She attends the occasional dinner at my house, speaks to me politely, and manages the distance between us with the same precision she applies to everything else. I do not require warmth from her. I require basic respect, and I receive it now. I attribute this less to any change in her character, and more to the fact that she now understands I am someone who responds to actions with equivalent ones and who is not likely to forget what he knows. This is not a hostile arrangement. It is an honest one. I find honest arrangements considerably easier to maintain than performances of feeling that neither party actually possesses. What I did at that wedding reception was not dramatic or theatrical. It was a legal decision made by the contracting party in response to being removed from the event financed by that very contract. No laws were broken. No one was physically harmed. 180 people ate from the emergency arrangements the venue scrambled to provide, which I am told were adequate. One marriage discovered, very early, that its foundations rested on an assumption that was not accurate. The assumption that the person paying would continue doing so regardless of how he was treated. That assumption was incorrect. Before you go, I have one question for you. If you had been in that lobby, what would you have done? Would you have waited quietly and let it pass? Or would you have made the same call? Tell me below.